Good evening or good morning or whatever time of day it is if you're watching the recording down the track, but welcome. I'm Andrew Hedges from Baker McKenzie, and today we're running through COP27 key outcomes and what they mean for 2023 and beyond. If we just move on to the next slide. I'm based in London and welcome you all. I'm joined by Ruth Dawes, partner in our Sydney office, and a great colleague, and also Lamyaa Gadelhak from Cairo, where COP was this year in Egypt. So we're really pleased to share our thoughts about what went on. Many of our team members were there over the 2 weeks. And I remind you that this is just one of many webinars and other materials that we produce and add on our Climate Hub, which you're welcome to look at any time. There's some great ones that we did with the ICC in the run-up, short, punchy ones around sustainability developments. There's some really interesting stuff there. I'd highly recommend it. Just go to the next slide. So COP, it's always a challenge to tease out what is important, what is less important, what is just the bureaucracy of international climate negotiations. So we tried to break it down for you today. We're going to cover some of the key outcomes. Article 6, because that's quite important to the private sector and is where a lot of investment might flow. Climate finance, generally, also key to that crossover between the public and the private. And then something slightly different, but increasingly becoming an important topic, and that's biodiversity and its interface with climate. So I'm going to hand off on the next, the housekeeping, don't forget that. We are being recorded. All participants are muted. It's only listen. We will make the slides available afterwards and this recording. And if you do want to ask questions, we love some questions. Please feel free to drop them in throughout using the Q&A function. And we've got some colleagues who will try and track that, highlight them to us, and we'll try and keep the pace up. So we've got time for a good discussion on some of those at the end. So now, this time, if we move on to the next slide, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Ruth. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Andrew, and thank you everyone for joining us today. We've got many people from many parts of the world with us, so thank you. We're going to talk about the key takeaways from COP27. This year was coined the Implementation COP, so the year to be putting, for parties to be putting their pledges into practice. And one of the key instruments that was delivered this year was the Sharm El-Sheikh Implementation Plan. And so in that plan, there was a recommitment to curbing global emissions to achieve a 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature increase. And you can see the language in the text there where the parties are reiterating that the impacts of climate change will be much lower at the temperature increase of 1.5 degrees Celsius compared with 2 degrees Celsius, and resolves to pursue further efforts to limit temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius. In terms of how the world is to meet that from a mitigation perspective, there was recognition that to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius requires rapid, deep, and sustained reductions in global greenhouse gas emissions of 43% by 2030, relative to 2019 levels. The implementation plan also acknowledged the importance of just transition and enhancing ambition. And there was a resolution to implement ambitious, just, equitable, and inclusive transitions to low emission and climate resilient development in line with the principles and objectives of the UNFCCC, the Kyoto Protocol, the Paris Agreement, the Glasgow Climate Pact, and other relevant COP decisions. And so really it's this principle of no country should be left behind as the world transitions to a low carbon economy. Next slide, please. Energy was a key feature of this COP. Again, there was this recognition of the urgent need for immediate, deep, rapid, and sustained reductions in global greenhouse gas emissions across all sectors, including through an increase in low emission and renewable energy, just energy transition partnerships, and cooperative actions. And there was also an important recognition that the timing of this COP was at the same time as an unprecedented global energy crisis. And really that's a reference to what is happening in the world, in particular in Ukraine with the war with Russia and the impact that has had on energy markets. And in the text, there is language around addressing that crisis through the acceleration and just transition to renewable energies. But there's also language around countries having diversified energy mixes and within their national interests. And at COP27, there was a Ukraine pavilion, which sought to highlight some of the impacts the war is having on the environment in Ukraine and its ability to transition to a low carbon economy to address the challenges of climate change. Also, part of the implementation plan identified adaptation, again, urging developed country parties to urgently and significantly scale up their provision of climate finance, technology transfer, and capacity building for adaptation, so as to respond to the needs of developing country parties. And finally, many would have seen in the press the milestone moment that was reached at COP27 regarding establishing funding arrangements to respond to loss and damage. And whilst the funding still needs to be determined, it has been considered a milestone moment of this COP. Lamyaa, would you care to share some of your thoughts and experiences of COP from an Egyptian perspective?
Sure. Thank you, Ruth. And thank you all for attending. So being on ground, Baker McKenzie, we've been on ground in Cairo since the 80s, and I can confidently say that there has been a change of scene pre-COP and post-COP. By pre-COP, I'm referring to the period that has commenced with the announcement that Egypt will be hosting COP27 and not just the days of the conference itself. The momentum leading to the event happening had an unprecedented impact in prioritizing environmental and climate change issues in decision-taking and policy, whether on the government or business level, or even on the level of society awareness of the threats. The previous pre-COP collective messaging was previous to COP, the collective messaging with respect to environmental and climate change issues was that they are, as a matter of fact, important issues, but not necessarily. And of course, the seriousness of the threat was acknowledged, but not necessarily on the top of list of priorities to be dealt with. However, this is no longer the case, and it is evidenced by the announcements made in COP27 with respect to the project launch and what type of projects are being launched, whether now or shortly. We are seeing a surge in all projects that relate to the green economy, such as renewables, desalination, hydrogen, electric infrastructure, among others. And the COP was hosted in Egypt with an African spirit, and I'm sure this is something all those who have attended or followed the COP27 or followed the news have sensed. So the outcome is more of an African outcome. We have seen, the Kenyan president announcing, the signature of framework agreement to produce green hydrogen in their country. The president of Tanzania also making announcements regarding 18 billion energy transition protocols over 12 Southern African countries that are connected via the Southern African Power Tool. And this, we're talking about solar and wind of around 8.4 gigawatts. The countries include Angola, Botswana, Congo, Lesotho, Mozambique, among others. Here in Egypt, we learned about the launch of the Just and Affordable Energy Transition Initiative, with the goal of providing all African citizens with access to clean energy, while also meeting the energy requirements needed for the continent's economic development. The EU has signed also new strategic hydrogen partnerships with Egypt and Namibia that would support South Africa to decarbonize the economy. this in itself is, in my view, is a very, very important positive outcome of hosting COP27 that is not necessarily visible to the rest of the world. So this shift is significant, and being here for so long is something that we, those on ground and witnessing the development of things can confirm. So Ruth, back to you for the next steps.
Thank you, Lamyaa. We'll just touch briefly on these next steps before we move on to Article 6. So scaling up of climate finance is obviously a key next step. Many would have seen in the press that the USD $100 billion climate finance goal was not met, sitting at around 83.3 billion. And a new goal will need to be set by 2024. We've talked about loss and damage fund, and the arrangements will be further developed at COP28. Engaging with and testing the Article 6 mechanisms is going to continue to be a focus for 2023. We'll talk in more detail in a moment, but there are no barriers to implementing cooperative approaches under Article 6.2 now, in the sense that countries can start participating in those mechanisms, although some further work will be required to operationalise Article 6.4 mechanisms. And then another step we will see in 2023 is further domestic policies to increase climate ambition. And this year has been very interesting because we've seen in many parts of the world, particularly in emerging markets, countries introduce their national climate change legislation, including to implement Article 6 requirements and to set their own national requirements as well in relation to Article 6, but also in respect of the interplay with the voluntary carbon market. And we'll continue to see that interplay evolve in the year to come. Next slide. Thank you.
Thanks, Ruth.
Thanks, Andrew.
I'm going to touch on where are we with Article 6. If we just go to the next slide. Thank you. First, Article 6.4, the project-based mechanism. So some call it the SDM, the Sustainable Development Mechanism. We go to the next slide. I feel like a child on a car trip. Are we there yet? I've got the grey hair to show that I was around when the Clean Development Mechanism, we were chasing that to be made operational. And we're sort of in the same process here. So in this slide, we just try to capture a little bit the different elements you need to come together to get to an operational Article 6.4. And I think there's some really good news, from this year in the build up to COP. The supervisory board was created. It's had over 3 meetings. We've got sort of, last count, 28 countries in the world designated their national authorities for the purposes of Article 6 matters. We've got a clear work plan on the way forward, and we've had some developments at COP, and some are very positive, and some of things being kicked down the road. So overall, I'd say we are on track, but there's probably going to be a little bit of delay, as there always is with ambitious programs to get ready. But as Ruth said earlier, this doesn't impact on the ability of countries to do Article 6.2 relationships and cooperative actions sort of now, and we'll hear more about that from Ruth. So if we go on to the next slide, it was a very interesting COP, because even though some of the decisions were around registry functions and the interoperability and some rules around confirming share of proceeds and issuance fees, sort of very operational basic things, it actually turned into almost a rerun, if you will, of some of the very tense discussions that occurred in Glasgow, where there was for those that have sort of been tracking Article 6.4 and Article 6 generally, there's this whole idea of corresponding adjustments. So that if you were to create Article 6 units that are to be used for another party's nationally determined contribution, there should be a corresponding adjustment to balance the books, if you will. And that was quite a fraught discussion in Glasgow, but it did result in ultimately a position that if units were to be used for an NDC or an other international mitigation purpose, there would be a corresponding adjustment. But here, we had a rerun of some of the arguments that occurred there, and it has come out with a different, or perhaps not a different, but they've teased out the detail perhaps. And what has now been agreed is that its corresponding adjustments is only really needed if you have a authorized 6.4 unit, so one that is authorized for an NDC or an OIMP. But you can have mitigation contribution here, so another term that's been created by the discussions, which if not authorized, and now they gave some examples. The inter alia language is important. This is not an exclusive list, but it was, so the examples were given for results-based finance, domestic mitigation, and contribution type ones, which is quite an important word they've used there. Now, why is this there? Well, from what we understand, a lot of developing country parties were pushing hard for this because it's about an interest in moving forward, giving themselves flexibility, but also recognizing they might not be in a position to implement corresponding adjustments in the near term. We're wanting to see Article 6.4 move forward and wanting its ability to generate credible outcomes through good methodologies, etc., to be used perhaps within their own country. So it's quite a significant development. We will be talking about it a lot, I think, in coming weeks, months, and years. And then I won't talk on those points at the end. You can see them in the slides, but some of these sort of basic points that had to be confirmed and that the SB had been developing recommendations on were picked up and confirmed at COP. So if I move to the next slide. Now, this is the one where we probably won't go into all the detail, but to make the point that for a functional Article 6.4, we do need methodologies or methodological guidance, and we do particularly need some guidance around, additionality. How is this mechanism going to be almost better than the CDM, which was sometimes critiqued for its lack of additionality? Unfortunately, the supervisory board were unable to finalize what were quite interesting and well-developed draft recommendations. So what happened was, by it being unable to make a proper recommendation, Substa at COP was unable to take that forward. And that's all being effectively pushed down the road to next year. But hopefully we will get there. To pick up Lamya's point about Africa and energy transition, Article 6 is not just about nature-based solutions, if and when those methodological guidances come through. The whitelist or pre-agreed technology choices for Africa that are additional will ultimately perhaps be able to be very quickly recognized for the purposes of Article 6, and will create the financial flows to help those African countries have a just transition. We move to the next slide. I think I'm going to hand back to Ruth for an update on 6.2.
Thank you, Andrew. And thank you for that overview. I think your comments on mitigation contribution, Article 6.4 emission reduction units were really quite interesting, because that was a significant development that's come out of the COP, and as you said, one that will afford flexibility to parties, and it's going to be interesting to see how that evolves going forward. And it is interesting when you look at it in the context of voluntary carbon markets, where for those projects too, under international law, there is no requirement for a corresponding adjustment as such, although as we're seeing as emerging markets introduce their national legislation at a national level, there could be such a requirement. So that brings us to Article 6.2 progress. And if I may have the next slide, please. So I thought it might be helpful just to give an overview of what the infrastructure looks like under Article 6.2. So there will be a centralized accounting and reporting platform, and then that will contain the international registry, which will in time connect with national registries and also with the Article 6.4 mechanism registry that you see in the row below. And the centralized platform will also hold the Article 6 database, which will have information on corresponding adjustments and emissions and the like, and also on potential inconsistencies. And so this is the framework, but this is all still to be established. So if we go to the next slide, please. So in terms of the developments that came out of COP27 on the operational infrastructure side, there was agreement for the Secretariat to implement an interim solution by January 2023 for the submission of information that is reporting to that centralized accounting reporting platform that we've just seen on the previous slide. Sorry, reporting until the centralized platform and the Article 6 database are released. And when we think about it, we're in December now, and January 2023 is not far around the corner. So there's a fair amount of work to be done. But it's this recognition that parties are already entering into frameworks for their cooperative approaches. And so it won't be long till there is information to be submitted. And so there's very much that need for an interim solution so that the pace of progress on projects is in sync with progress on the development and implementation of these institutional mechanisms. And the Secretariat has also been requested to provide an interim solution for participating parties until the international registry becomes operational. And that's not expected to become operational until around 2024. So again, there'll be some further work to be done there. A further, well, maybe a non-development, one of the other notable matters at COP27 was that the authorization procedures for authorization of IPMOs were not finalized. So as we go into 2023, there's going to be more work done there, and many in the audience would have seen some of the debates around can authorizations be amended or revoked, and the rules around that will continue to be developed and determined. The other developments were, I guess, more mechanical in nature, dealing with the tracking of IPMOs, although there was also agreement on establishing expert technical review, which have a mandate for reviewing the consistency and veracity of information that's submitted by participating parties. And just so parties are aware, there is an option for some of that information to be confidential if certain reasons are provided. And there were some other mechanical aspects in relation to reporting obligations. Next slide, please. And then on carbon markets, so there was no specific clarification on leveraging voluntary carbon markets and the interplay with Article 6. As we were saying before, the voluntary carbon markets will sit independently of Article 6 as such, and there's no need for a corresponding adjustment for those projects at an international level, but it's certainly one to monitor under national legislation for those participating in the projects. But the parties entering into Article 6.2 cooperative approaches have flexibility to determine what those approaches are and what other international mitigation purposes are. And so through those cooperative approaches, there's also potential for some interplay with the voluntary carbon markets. And then
Ruth,
yeah, please. Yeah, thank you, Andrew.
But no, it's just interesting, some of the discussions we've been having, some great people at IETA who've been talking with. And one of the interesting things a colleague there was saying was these mitigation contribution 6.4 ERs, will they almost become another voluntary market, in the sense if the voluntary market doesn't have corresponding adjustments, and then you've got this other kind of unit that sits under Paris, but is very similar in many respects, particularly if it picks up some of the methodological developments that the voluntary market has worked on for so many years. It will be a very interesting interplay.
Yeah, I agree. And then it's
positive in a way. Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's right. And then it'll be interesting to see how the voluntary arrangements around integrity in the voluntary carbon market develop, and how the rules for mitigation contribution Article 6.4 projects develop in terms of environmental integrity and enhancing ambition, and whether they develop in parallel, or if there are nuances between the two. So it's next year is going to be interesting in that regard. Yeah, so thank you for that, Andrew. So then just some key announcements. So the US announced the US Energy Transition Accelerator, which is intended to catalyze private capital to invest in clean energy transition in developing countries. And then the African Carbon Market Initiative was also announced, which aims to generate and retire more than 300 million offsets a year by 2030, and between 1.5 to 2.5 billion a year by 2050. And that was quite significant in the context that COP27 was an African COP, and so it was quite an exciting development. And there was also an important announcement from the Egypt Pavilion about a new Egyptian carbon market. And Lamyaa, it'd be great to hear from you on.
Yeah, actually, I was going to ask you if I could also jump in here, because this fits in exactly with what I was saying at the beginning of the webinar, how there is a sense of whether the Egyptian carbon market was not something that was it's not a project that was there for a long time, but there is now a stronger will to provide the infrastructure to cater for the progress and the development in that area very soon. I'm aware that there are very robust and fast track plan to have this in place very soon, and linking as much as possible with Africa. So this is actually part of the progress we are witnessing and the speed of things happening lately in the area of climate change related matters.
Thank you so much for that, Lamyaa. Andrew, do you want to say any opening remarks before we move into climate finance?
No, I think we'll move on in case we get some questions at the back end.
That sounds good. So I'll just highlight, if we go over to the next slide, please. There were, thank you for that. There were some interesting elements of the implementation plan on finance, and really it was around the sort of global finance flows that we need to be able to achieve to transition to a low carbon economy. And so in the Sharm El-Sheikh Implementation Plan, there was recognition that developing countries require USD 5.8 to 5.9 trillion per year to respond to climate change and meet their nationally determined contributions for the pre-2030 period. Investment of USD 4 to 6 trillion per year is required for the world to transform to a low carbon economy. And importantly, USD 4 trillion per year needs to be invested in renewable energy up to 2030 to be able to reach net zero emissions by 2050. And as we were saying earlier, as we come into 2023, it's just 7 years for that amount of money to flow into renewables to achieve that target. And just in terms of context where we're sitting, global flows for global climate flows, we're sitting at around USD 803 billion for the 2019 to 2020 period, which is about a third of where it needs to be to hit those requirements that have been identified in the implementation plan. Next slide, please. And then just briefly on adaptation, so new pledges were made, totaling more than $230 million to be transferred into the adaptation fund, and share of proceeds from Article 6.4 mechanism projects will also be transferred into that fund. And there's a little bit more clarity on what those proceeds will look like if anyone's interested in that, specifically for Article 6.4. And then on loss and damage, as we said earlier, the fund itself and the amount will still need to be developed and determined, but there was support for implementation of $3.1 billion for an early warnings for all initiative within the next 5 years. And so Lamyaa, would you be able to speak to us in a bit more detail on climate finance and what you're seeing from your perspective in Africa and Egypt?
Yeah, sure. So I am actually a project and finance lawyer, so based in Africa. So this is hits my sweet spot. While the sessions at the COP27 drove action across areas, as you know, raising climate ambition, financing the net zero transition, accelerating decarbonization, water security, and among others. And you know, earlier in the webinar, I presented a bit of the projects that were you know, presented as and announced by the different countries. Meanwhile, the continent only receives 5.5% of the climate financing, while it's only responsible for generating around 3% of all greenhouse gas emissions. So Africa has tremendous project development need and potential, but none of this potential is possible without financing. And as you mentioned in the earlier slides, the finance goals of COP27, a big chunk of that is should be going to developing countries, and by developing countries, a big chunk of that should go to Africa. Okay, so among those, there were a lot of finance initiative announcements made, especially dedicated to Africa. Among those announcements, the announcements made by President Biden with respect to accelerating Egypt's clean energy economy, enhancing climate ambition, and supporting energy security. So the Germany and the US announced around, I think, over $250 million with resources to unlock $10 billion in commercial investments to support Egypt's clean energy economy. And this will reflect in the program will deploy 10 gigawatt of new wind and solar energy, while decommissioning 5 gigawatt of inefficient natural gas generation. Another interesting initiative is the South African Just Energy initiative. So African carbon, which we have covered extensively in a note that is prepared by our Joburg office, and this will be available among the slides to consult together with all other initiatives that are particularly dedicated to Africa in our African hub. But to give you a bit more sense of the South African Just Energy Transition Investment Plan. So this is a 5-year investment plan for $8.5 billion financing package, which is part of the country's Just Energy Transition Partnership with France, Germany, the UK, and the US, and the EU. That's from COP26. It covers electricity, new energy vehicles, green hydrogen, and identifies $98 billion in financial requirements over the next 5 years to come, both from the public and the private sector. I don't want to, you know, keep listing what was announced, because these can be consulted quite easily. But I want to analyze how this can become reality. So any project would require, especially in the continent, would require financing, and these are all, you know, great announcement improving availability of financing, but the challenge is really the actual deployment of the financing or full deployment of those pledges. We have read about many pledges, financing pledges since, you know, COP26 and before that, but have they really been deployed? There seems to be areas of easier deployment of financing than others. So from our experience, you know, sitting in the African continent, we have witnessed that, you know, achievements are contagious across the continent. So an easy example is renewable energy projects, with, you know, maybe a decade back was not so easy to finance and deploy and develop. But if you go back and consider how this industry has developed in the African continent, you will find that, you know, certain jurisdictions have been able to successfully develop and finance those projects, renewable energy projects, and then it became contagious in other jurisdictions in the African continent. So Africa is large, it has big plans. You may be aware of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which is a very important treaty for the continent, which aims to significantly increase the trade among African countries. And why is this relevant to this discussion? Simply because to boost trade, you need robust infrastructure and manufacturing facilities. Okay, and this translates into creating projects that would cater for that ability. And with, you know, the commitments to reduce emissions, to mitigate, and all the financing pledges. So there's a golden opportunity here for, you know, financing for, you know, just transition, and for developing countries in need of further development, having the right financing to actually, you know, roll out and see it become more of a reality. So as a banking and projects lawyer, an Egyptian one based in Egypt, but covering also the African continent, it's a very exciting time for us, and we hope to see things, you know, financing become more and more concrete. Thank you, Ruth.
One quick one for you, Lam, there.
Sure.
I don't know if you will, I don't think you will have an answer for this, but I do know that the last time around with the Clean Development Mechanism, that it never really drove, say, renewables financing. In fact, project financiers would prefer just, you know, subsidies or other financial flows. And I think the really interesting question, if we get to scale with Article 6 mechanisms, particularly country-to-country deals, is could it be different this time? Could the ability to create units under Article 6 act as a additional revenue stream to try and help that, you know, those infrastructure needs and those project finance needs? And I don't know the answer to that. I think one of the things that is needed for that is price certainty on the value of the units generated. And things like the exchange announcement in Egypt and other exchanges, that sort of liquidity development in carbon markets might be the parallel tool that could help.
Actually, thank you, Andrew, for raising this, because the CDM was a very important milestone for, you know, climate change work in Egypt. So it was very successful. You know, and I think particularly Egypt, it has the highest number of registered CDM projects in Africa. And, you know, the whole Kyoto phase was the start of, you know, let's say an early stage of awareness in the market, you know, attaching an economic value to you know, reduction of emissions and those efforts. Not every there was an awareness barrier. I remember, you know, meeting with other with clients back in the early 2000s with other lawyers from the climate change practice in the firm, and there were those who, you know, were very interested because of the economic benefit of it, and the carbon market at the time was booming. But there was also an information barrier that was a real barrier. You would get out of the meeting and you can tell that they don't get it. Okay, but in general, CDM was successful in terms of a mechanism, and that's why you always hear, especially in our area, always comparing to the CDM, because this is what they're familiar with. But I don't think this is a reason why, renewable energy is, I think the hurdle or the problem with it being developed earlier is actually linked to the technology and the price of technology at the time. And so, of course, it will add to its attractiveness, but I think CDM was a success for the region, but the renewable part is more of a different, it has other, not just this, but many other reasons for it not to have been deployed then.
Thanks.
Thank you. So I think, Ruth, your turn to give us more about the diversity piece.
Yes, thank you. I'll just do a couple of closing remarks on biodiversity before we move on to questions, and we do encourage questions because we love having them. So just on biodiversity, so we saw in the Paris Agreement and also at COP26 and now importantly at COP27, this important recognition of the interrelationship between climate change and biodiversity, and that we're not going to be able to tackle one problem without tackling the other. They're interlinked. And this COP is interesting in terms of the timing, because COP27 was in November, and under the International Convention on Biological Diversity, the second part of COP15 to that convention will be held in December in Canada. And so we saw a number of nature pledges being given by countries during COP27. Many countries were coming out and pledging a commitment to conserve 30% of their lands and 30% of their waters by 2030. And I think in counting at the moment, there's about 112 countries who have committed to that pledge. And as we move into COP15, that's one of the items on the agenda, is setting targets and timetables for nature. And it's a very interesting parallel, because as we saw many corporates come out over recent years and commit their net zero carbon targets, we're seeing now corporations also come out and commit their nature targets as well. So Andrew, I note the time, might just hand over to you now, given that we're getting close to the 45 minutes.
Good. Well, there is more detail on those slides, so those will be available, as we said. We've got a shy audience today. We haven't had any questions yet, but we've had a good discussion as we've gone through. So I think we might actually consider wrapping up, unless Lamyaa or yourself, Ruth, had any final thoughts for the audience.
Well, only just to say thank you to everyone for their time in joining us today, and for the support this year. So we really do appreciate it. Lamyaa, did you have any?
I can only second that and just encourage them whenever they have questions to reach out to us directly. Be happy to address any issues or questions they have.
Yes, absolutely, because we all want to actually turn all this international dialogue into actual projects on the ground, because that's where the real benefits can arise. So thanks again, everyone, and looking forward to